Yesterday, as I was ready to get down to the serious part of the sermon, taking all those scattered notes and readings and ideas that I'd been collecting and turning them into an actual sermon, we lost our Wi-Fi connection. Now, normally that wouldn't really be a very big deal, but my desktop computer was at the repair shop, so I was working on my laptop. And my laptop doesn't have any word processing software on it, so I was using Google Docs. So all my preliminary work, my notes, my ideas, the beginnings of my rough draft, I had typed them all into a set of Google Docs that I now could not access. It looked like I'd not only be having to start from scratch, but also going back to the good old days of writing it all out longhand on yellow legal pads. Some of you may remember the days when we wrote longhand on yellow legal pads. There was a time when cut and paste were very literal terms. As you might imagine, this situation was not exactly conducive to ruminating on gratitude. Or maybe it was, because I had been thinking all week about the importance of cultivating gratitude precisely when it doesn't come naturally. And maybe it was because of that, but I didn't get nearly as worked up about this situation as I might have. I'm not sure I managed to feel actively grateful for anything in those first few moments of panic, but I wasn't particularly upset either. I was just trying to work through what I would do. I even found myself remembering times when I had gotten real satisfaction out of working the old-fashioned way, writing things out, including one stormy power outage several years ago when I sat by the wood stove by candlelight, writing by hand a long and complex eulogy for a funeral I was doing the next day. I wasn't exactly excited about doing it that way this time, but at least I knew that I could. Now, as it turns out, the problem was just a temporary power supply issue. In other words, I had accidentally unplugged the router. So once I plugged it back in, everything was working normally, and I was good to go. But the funny thing was, before the little hiccup with the Wi-Fi, I had been feeling really cranky about having to write this sermon on the laptop, which is much less comfortable for me than my desktop computer, and having to use Google Docs, which I find much more cumbersome than the word processing program in OpenOffice that I'm so accustomed to. And now, suddenly, a working laptop that could connect to my Google Drive seemed like an absolute miracle. Now, if you watched my little video clip to publicize this sermon, you heard me tell about Angelo, the elderly gentleman who lived in a nursing home where I served as chaplain. He would always be out on the front porch feeding the squirrels when I arrived in the morning. And one day when I called out to him, "Angelo, isn't it a beautiful day?" he replied, "Every day above ground is a beautiful day." The Zen teacher, Soketsu Norman Fisher, says that a lack of gratitude means that we are not paying attention. He wrote, we take life, we take existence for granted. We take it as a given, and then we complain that it isn't working out as we wanted it to. But why should we be here in the first place? Why should we exist at all? Well, when you look at it that way, every day above ground really does seem pretty beautiful, downright miraculous, no matter what kind of day it might be. But it is so easy to forget to be grateful for something as simple and basic as still being alive. My husband is Danish, and he likes to say that one of the reasons the Danish people are among the happiest people in the world is the fact that they have low expectations. Now, that can sound somewhat cynical, and actually speaking as the person that he chose to marry, I find it vaguely insulting sometimes. But his point, of course, is that a lot of unhappiness in our lives comes from the contrast between how things are and how we think they ought to be. And if we can let go of some of the expectations and just look honestly at the way things are, sometimes there's a lot to appreciate. When I lost my wireless connection, albeit briefly, I stopped worrying about which computer I had to use. I didn't need the optimal setup in order to feel grateful. I just needed something that would work. I needed to be reminded of how miraculous it is to be able to do the things I do every day using technology that was unimaginable to me when I started in ministry. That anxious 20 minutes, yes, it took me that long to check to see whether or not the router was plugged in. That anxious 20 minutes was enough to jolt me out of taking it all for granted. The poem that Sandy read this morning reminds us of just how many things we forget to notice. When I think how far the onion has traveled just to enter my stew today, I could kneel and praise all small, forgotten miracles. I cook a lot. I have chopped many onions, hundreds of onions, maybe thousands of onions. I chop them up and I forget what a miracle they are, disappearing into the dish to give depth and flavor without calling attention to themselves. Life is full of such small, forgotten miracles. Brené Brown, the author and research professor who has written so beautifully on the power of vulnerability, said this once in an interview: "I don't have to chase extraordinary moments to find happiness. It's right in front of me if I'm paying attention and practicing gratitude." According to one study I looked at, people who practice gratitude consistently report a host of benefits: physical, psychological, and social benefits. They have stronger immune systems, fewer aches and pains, lower blood pressure, better sleep patterns. They experience more joy, pleasure, and optimism. They're more generous, more compassionate, and more forgiving, and they feel less isolated and less lonely. What's not to like about all of that? We probably all know that gratitude is good for us, but that doesn't mean it's always easy to cultivate it. Of course, experiencing gratitude is easy when big and wonderful things happen. And it's still relatively easy when life is just rolling along normally. If, as Brené Brown says, we pay attention and remember to appreciate things like the onion on our cutting board or the Wi-Fi connection that powers our communication. But when life really does not feel okay, it gets a lot harder to cultivate gratitude. We may know that it's good for us to do it, but it may feel like a real stretch to try to count our blessings when we're struggling with serious problems. Buddhist teaching often emphasizes that we should be grateful for adversity, because it is when we confront difficulties that we have the greatest opportunity to grow and learn. I think of the story that Don Starr told this morning about the samurai who demanded to be taught about heaven and hell. The monk was able to show him how destructive his arrogance and his anger were. And it must surely have been a painful moment for the samurai. And yet he was able to experience profound gratitude in that moment because it taught him something so important. Most of us find it very uncomfortable to receive criticism or correction. But sometimes we can be grateful even for the discomfort if it offers us a chance to learn. During election week, when things were pretty tense around our house as we waited for results, we dealt with it by binge-watching The Queen's Gambit on Netflix. I won't give anything too important away in case you're thinking of watching it, but it's adapted from a novel about a young girl growing up in an orphanage in the 50s who becomes a chess prodigy. And it follows her development both as a chess player and as a human being. She is somewhat lacking in social skills as a result of her upbringing. She's obsessed with chess and she's obsessed with winning. And for me, some of the most striking moments came when she meets again people that she has beaten badly in the past at tournaments. And they say to her something like, "Oh, I remember you, you really cleaned my clock." And she says, "Oh, I'm sorry." And they say, No, I learned so much. I'm grateful to you for the chance to have played and lost because of what I learned. You can just see on her face what a foreign concept that is to her, the idea of being grateful for losing. But you can also see her gradually realizing that there might be something in it. The American Buddhist teacher Jack Kornfield quotes his own Thai meditation teacher, Ajahn Chah, as saying to him, "Which has had more value in your life? Where have you grown more and learned more? Where have you become more wise? Where have you learned patience, understanding, equanimity, and forgiveness? In your hard times or in the good ones?" Now, I chose to write this sermon because despite a pretty good life, I've been sunk in a really bad attitude lately. I'm angry about the divisiveness in our culture, and I'm angry with myself because I know my anger is feeding into that divisiveness and making it worse. I'm grieving. I'm grieving the loss of normality in the face of the pandemic. I'm grieving Thanksgiving and Christmas with my family, even as I know what a small loss that is compared to so many others. But our opening hymn, inviting us to give thanks for those gathered here and those far away, brought a real lump to my throat. If I, who have so much to be grateful for, have trouble cultivating gratitude right now, how much harder must it be for so many others? And yet it's precisely when circumstances feel least conducive to gratitude that we need a sense of gratitude the most. Because we need the resilience and the optimism and the hopefulness that come with it. I respect the Buddhist teaching that we should be grateful for adversity, but I can't always live it. I can't be grateful that I won't be with my sister this Thanksgiving and that she will spend Thanksgiving alone. But she reminded me that we can be very grateful to have the kind of family relationships that cause us to grieve when we can't gather. So many people aren't that lucky. I don't think cultivating gratitude means that we have to be grateful for everything that comes to us. Maybe that's the ideal. If we could do that, we'd be better off. But I have certainly had experiences for which I am not able to feel grateful. I do think that sometimes good eventually comes out of painful experiences, and that we can wind up being grateful for something later that we were not able to be grateful for at the time. I think back to my middle school years when I was relentlessly tormented by my peers, and it was just a devastating time. Nothing I could find gratitude for at the time. But in retrospect, the compassion that it taught me has been an enormous foundational piece of my ministry. And without that experience, I don't know whether I could have developed that depth of compassion. And I also believe that when we can't be grateful for what's happening in the moment, we can still look for something in that moment for which we can be grateful. And going back to the same experience, I remember coming home from school one day, pouring out to my mother how devastated I was by the events of the day. It's going to sound so pathetic now, but saying to my mom, my stoic New England mom, who hardly ever showed emotion, saying, "I just don't think it's too much to ask that I should have one friend." And she just began to cry and took my hand and said, "Oh, honey, I don't think it's too much to ask either." And in that moment, I was able to be grateful for the loving presence that sat beside me on the bed, even as I could not be grateful for the experience that I had had that day. I've always hated the expression, "count your blessings," because it always seems to imply that your troubles aren't really very significant and you should just smile and look on the bright side and everything will be okay. The fact is that some things are not okay. We really do suffer in our lives. Suffering is real, difficult and painful experiences are real, and they don't go away when we count our blessings. But if we can find ways to experience gratitude in the midst of that kind of suffering, we can find better grounding for the turbulence of our lives and get through the painful experiences with greater resilience. And after the process of writing this sermon, I have realized that it doesn't even have to be conscious. We don't even have to be actively trying to cultivate gratitude in the moment. And I'll tell you why I think that. I have a lot of trouble sleeping. I have had for a number of years, but it's worse lately, as it is for so many people lately, given the anxiety of the world we live in. And usually when I'm lying awake in the middle of the night, as I so often am, I feel really resentful about it. I dread the day to come and how tired I will be. I keep looking at the clock and thinking, well, if I could fall asleep in the next 10 minutes, I could at least get 2 hours before I have to get up. But this week, all week, the song that Angie sang for the offering, that song, Grateful, from Urban Myths, from the musical, has been stuck in my head. When Vincent sent out the music selections, that was one I wasn't familiar with. So I went on YouTube to find out what it was, and I listened to it. It was so lovely, but it also felt a little Pollyanna-ish to me at first, I have to admit. For one thing, the man who was singing it had one of those incredibly sweet voices that sometimes I just kind of resist. But it was also that count your blessings kind of advice that I sometimes resent. But it is a really beautiful song, and it stuck in my head, especially the refrain. I could not stop singing it all week. Grateful, grateful, truly blessed, and duly grateful. And I found that in the night when I was lying awake, that's what was going through my head, that refrain. And then there was even that line in the song, sometimes I lie awake counting blessings instead of sheep, and then I cracked up. And you know, the nights this week were not as bad. They were just as restless and just as sleepless. But I didn't mind as much. It didn't feel as bad. I wasn't actually counting my blessings. I was just singing about the idea of counting my blessings. And I wasn't even singing the song in my mind in an attempt to be grateful. It was just stuck there and I couldn't get it out, one of those beautiful earworms that stay with you. But I lay awake last night, for example, around 3, and I actually just enjoyed listening to the sound of the rain on the roof. And I'm sure it was because of that song. So I am grateful, truly grateful am I, to have encountered that song this week. You know, I recently came across a quotation that has really stuck with me. Apparently, I looked it up because I couldn't remember to whom it had been attributed when I first saw it. And apparently, it's often attributed to Voltaire. But in fact, it comes from the author Peter Gay, who was offering an analysis on the philosophy of Voltaire's Candide. So this is Peter Gay paraphrasing what he understands the philosophy of Candide to be. And the quotation is, "Life is a shipwreck, but we must not forget to sing in the lifeboats." Life is a shipwreck, but we must not forget to sing in the lifeboats. I quoted it to a friend, so excited to have discovered this wonderful quotation, and she hated it. She said, "Oh, that's so negative. Oh, that just makes me feel awful." But to me, it was just right. I mean, right now, there are a lot of things about life that really do feel like a shipwreck. And yet, that quotation asks for gratitude without belittling the reality of the discomfort and the challenges that we're facing. So this whole sermon feels tremendously presumptuous to me, for me to be whining about my need to be grateful when probably so many of you are struggling with much harder things than I am right now. But my prayer for you and for all of us is that when life feels like a shipwreck, we can recognize and identify the lifeboats and find a way to sing. And I know that for me, probably the most powerful lifeboat that I experience in those shipwreck times are the relationships in my lives. The family, the friends, the church community. When I feel like I can't do it alone, those are the people who remind me that I don't have to. So I invite us to close by singing together a song that reminds us of just that. Let's sing together, Lean on Me.